I'm just saying I'm not finished yet. Search for it, swing for it, discover the me that lives in yes. Stand for it, stretch for it. It's my time, imagine my best. Run for it, reach for it, uncover the me that lives in yes. I know, yes I know, there'll be miracles wherever I go. It's not work, it's play. I can make magic today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Senior Nation. I'm your host, Phyllis Ayman, and you are listening to SORC TV Network, WTSN, Washington, D.C. We are indeed a senior nation with 100 plus million adults over the age of 50. And we are here to bring you up-to-date information about successful aging, healthful longevity, and becoming what I call a well-ager, to dignity, respect, quality of life, and quality of care for our parents, our grandparents, and our loved ones. We at Senior Nation will be your trusted voice for informed choices, meaningful conversations, and a vibrant life at every age. Though the SORC TV Network is known for its dedication to bringing the highest level of jazz content to the watching and listening audience, the owners of the network are also dedicated to bringing this important content to this fast-growing demographic. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. So let's begin with today's show. I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's guest, Mel Albin, who was able to step in at the last minute when my guest couldn't quite make it. Mel is CEO for the SORC TV Network, one of the largest broadcast stations on the East Coast, reaching a North American audience of nearly 3 million and over 38 million global viewers and listeners monthly. He's produced award-winning streaming radio shows and was an artist manager for 2 decades. Mel has his own weekly streaming show, the Jazz Confusion Power Hour, Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Mel is also the owner of MEA Holdings, LLC, a multimedia enterprise that currently features the SORC TV Network, shopblackenterprise.com, and the Black Businesses Matter Live Aid Concert.com. He has spent a good portion of his career in academia as a full-time undergraduate, graduate faculty member and program administrator at a variety of institutions, and ultimately served as the executive MBA program at what is now the University of Maryland Global Campus, and created and was the executive director for the Graduate Program Center for Global Enterprises at McDaniel College. He has a PhD in neuropsychology, which led him to have a clinical psychology practice in New York, specializing in borderline patients, and was a consultant at the New York Presbyterian Hospital in the Coma Recovery Program. Mel is the founder of Albin Enterprises of Ohio Ltd, an employee benefits education consultancy with a variety of high-profile corporate clients, including the Federal Reserve of Cleveland, Ohio, AT&T, Disney, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, and many, many others. He's also served as vice president for strategy and communications, and later senior consultant at Diversified Investment Advisors, which was renamed Transamerica Retirement Services. He holds a bachelor's in political science, a master's degree in U.S. economic and business history, an MBA in business administration, econometrics, investment portfolio analysis, and a dual PhD in U.S. business and economic history and neuropsychology. Mel recently completed a manuscript from Slave to Millionaire, The Oranges of Black Contemporary Civil Rights Leadership. His interests focus on Black and minority micro businesses too small for Amazon or Shopify, but represents over 95% of all Black businesses in the United States. And on a personal note, because of Mel's knowledge and passion for the older population, and in particular, the multi-generation family, he was able to instantly recognize the importance of a show on this topic. And I'm so deeply grateful that he invited me to host Senior Nation on his network. So, Mel, I'm thrilled to have you here with me tonight.
Hi, Phyllis. How are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Fine. That was a nice introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's all true. I mean, if there anything that you wanted to add, anything I missed?
No, you pretty much got it all. I did audit medical school for 2 years when I lived in Cleveland.
Oh,
at the Cleveland Clinic.
that's
So I
cool.
I did that also. My mother once said about me, I've told you this before, my mother said to a neighbor, my son has been educated beyond his intelligence.
And I think when you told me that, I said, oh, I think I get it. No.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
No, but the reality is, and I'm sure people watching and listening will probably be able to tell that we have a wonderful relationship. We've spent hours on the telephone talking about many, many, many different subjects. And you're so knowledgeable about, this particular area that is my focus, my passion. And, I know you wrote a book about this multicultural family. So, I mean, multi-generational family. So do you want to talk about that a little bit and have people get an idea of how that has changed over time?
Yeah, this is really interesting. When I was a graduate student, I had a good friend, Dominic Cavallo, who has since passed. And Dom and I both had an interest in new history. There was quantitative history. There was all new directions that history was going in that were different from what had preceded it. And there was a historian, John Demos, that wrote a book on Plymouth, Massachusetts, but he wrote pretty extensively. It's a very short book. It's about 100 pages, but it was a brilliant book. And he wrote about families and misconceptions we had about early American and colonial families.
Mm-hmm.
We had this image from the Scarlet Letter that everybody married young and they were 16 or 14. But
right.
But there were so many studies that were being done. There was a study about Lockridge, Massachusetts, and the study revealed that when settlers came to this country, there was no disease. So when they came here from England, they assumed they'll be dead by 45. They'll have 10 children, 8 will die in childbirth or from disease.
Right.
And they practiced the same kind of behavior. The difference was they were living into their 70s because there was no disease. So these were some of the misconceptions we had. So here was the problem. They had a piece of land that they thought they would give to their firstborn son. But when they had 10 children, they all lived. There wasn't enough land. So a lot of the males had to postpone marriage until they're able to provide for a family, because it was land-based culture.
Huh.
And so this started me on a real interest in, how do we think about the family over time? That's one thing. And the second thing, what are the misconceptions we have about families? So Dom and I wrote a book. It was called Family Life in America from 1600 to 2000. We wrote the book in 1980, but we made it 1600 to 2000.
So wait, I have a question if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if they lived until about the 70s, which of course most of us don't think is really, that was really the case. So it's great to know that. When did that change? When did the life expectancy or our perception that the life expectancy was much lesser in years than that?
Great question. And it had to do with urbanization. As soon as we started to develop cities, we developed people living close to each other. We developed diseases. People were coming in from Europe into cities like New Amsterdam that became Manhattan, Boston. And as disease grew, longevity decreased substantially. You know, and then there was the American Revolution, and you know, it killed. We weren't a big nation; it killed off a lot of young males. You know, and so you can see a change beginning probably about 1720 to 1750. We start to see a decline in the age of mortality, and it's
So,
mostly rooted in disease.
here's another question that just came to mind. So, okay, it started to decrease. Because of people coming in, so many people coming in from other countries and people living in close proximity to each other. You know, I don't want to use the word ghetto, but they were kind of set up these little communities that you could think of that in that way, right?
Yeah.
Not as a derogatory term, but just that because of the nature of how they lived and so close to each other. But did it also have to do with the fact, or was there a change when also we started to consume food that was more processed, or food that wasn't, locally sourced, or food that was out of season, or food that was shipped from elsewhere? Was there another shift in terms of our expectancy and the number of diseases when that happened?
Well, again, you're looking at urbanization as the key factor here. And, you know, as the Civil War comes about and so much new technology emerged in the Civil War, and people were living in cities. If you remember the movie, The Gangs of New York, you know, they were ghettoized. The Irish lived in one area, Italians lived in another area, Jews in another. They were becoming ghettoized and living in very cramped conditions and very poor conditions.
Right.
You know, so you know, it wasn't until after the Civil War that in New York City you started having around Central Park, and the Central Park was developed by this guy Frederick Laura Olmsted that came out of the South, and he was you might call him the national park designer. He became the expert on bringing the Garden of Eden to cities and
Oh,
parks, and so he actually did Central Park, and around Central Park on Fifth Avenue you had mansions that the mansions took up a whole block.
correct.
And those were the suburbs of the cities back then. It was moving northward in Manhattan. You had South Philadelphia was the ghettoized area for Italians and Irish, and you know, so you know, the cities and really developed these enclaves where people were relatively poor and packed together. And so when you had a plague or a disease spreading, it affected everybody, the wealthy as well as the poor. The difference
Right,
was
right.
the wealthy could leave the city. They can leave and go somewhere else.
Right,
Until it was
right.
over.
And they often did to areas that were more open and spacious. I mean, I did much of 2024. I was doing some work in upstate New York, and it's, you know, land-based. I mean, it's spacious. They're open air. I mean, it's a very different, and they actually, the wealthy from the cities did go up there in the summer and create these beautiful camp-like grounds and
Newport, Rhode
mansions.
Island.
Yeah.
Newport, Rhode Island. It was
No,
designed
absolutely.
for the wealthy, you know. And you know, it's kind of interesting. There was a slave, a young boy. His mother was a slave. The master had given the mother to a ship captain, and this was in the South. This was not far from Memphis, Tennessee. And when the Civil War broke out, the father of this boy, who had sex with this slave woman who was given to him as a concubine by the slave owner, the boy was light skinned and looked white, even though his mother was black. His father was white, and a ship captain owned this steamer, you know, this paddle wheel steamer on the
Right.
Mississippi River. Well, the Confederacy conscripted all of those paddle wheel ships to fight against the Northern Navy that was coming down.
Right.
And so these ships had carried cotton up and down the Mississippi. Now they are conscripted. Well, they got into a battle. The father told the son to jump overboard. He ended up in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis had a plague. They had a serious plague, a scarlet fever.
Ah,
It killed off 80% of the population. The other 20%
wow.
fled. So here's this kid who was a slave, and now he was like in his late teens, early 20s. He started buying up property for pennies on the dollar, and he created Beale Street in Memphis. This is
Wow.
It's a fascinating story, but he created the first Black entertainment center. And again, there's so much that we have misunderstood
Hmm.
about families, and then this is another family structure where there was a concubine, a white ship captain, and his son became a friend of Sojourner Truth, and and also people that were anti-lynching, and the families that we think dominated areas of our culture, we don't understand where
Mm.
they came from to a large extent. So, my interest in the family started to grow a lot. And then, of course, I had a clinical practice, and I was a psychologist. I worked with borderlines, but I was always intrigued by how they described their relationships with family, friends, coworkers, people in a hierarchy who they may have to report to, people who reported to them. I was always I was always interested in the matrix of relationships and how people determine their roles.
Hmm.
About this time, about the same time, they're looking at the 1980s, I started to notice there was a change happening in generational families.
Right. So, but wait,
Yeah,
I just want to
go ahead.
be, I exactly what you just veered off into exactly what I wanted to ask you about. And that was about this shift in families, in the generation families, although I think it's come much more recently, I would
Mhm.
say in the
Yeah.
last maybe 15, 20 years as people are living longer. But I think people probably will, it's a novel idea that they probably haven't thought about. And you have such a great way of explaining it. So I'm glad you just kind of veered off into exactly what I wanted to ask you about.
Well, let me tell you again. I was on a panel for the American Historical Association for a book that had gotten much acclaim. It was called Families Against the Cities, and the author, Richard Sennett, he had the hypothesis that there were extended families, and industrialization produced the nuclear family because because of changes that took place in wealth and status. But when I was on the panel, I read the footnotes, everything.
You
Um,
probably are too smart for your own good, or whatever it was that your mother said.
yeah.
I think she was onto something there, Mel.
So I found in his footnotes his end sample for how many people he could track generationally by last name and first name. You had to drop off everybody whose name was Smith or Jones. You
Right,
couldn't
right.
trace them. Well, his end sample ended up being 15 people for his hypothesis that the extended family became a nuclear family. So I looked at this and I said, we got to do better than this. This is just junk. you know?
Right.
In fact, at the conference, Richard Sennett was there, and he's told everybody that there is now a new agent provocateur, and he named me as the agent provocateur. But I guess my point is we have such a poor understanding of family structure, how it relates to the economy, how it relates to specific
Ah,
periods of time. Like, for example, in 1918, we had a plague in this country, and it was smallpox.
right.
No, it wasn't smallpox. What was it?
It wasn't it smallpox?
Maybe it
Wasn't it?
was smallpox. I think it was. No, no, it was the flu. It was the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu in 1918. And
Okay. All right.
and here's the thing. World War One wiped out 35 million people. The Spanish flu in the same year that World War One ended wiped out 50 million people.
Oh, wow. I bet.
So
Yeah, that's
so
huge.
so think about the impact on families. We're living together, multi generations in one household. And by the time you get to the early 20th century, the age of mortality was closer to 65. It had dropped over 10 years
Correct.
historically. Okay,
Correct.
and
And
that's how they arrived at 65 for Social Security. They figure
right.
everybody will be dead by then, so nobody will collect.
Well, and obviously, with people living longer, everything is about longevity now and the advances in science and people not necessarily living more healthfully, although that's something that I'm very focused on and passionate about, but just living longer. I'm sure most people listening know or viewing know somebody in their 80s, 90s. I mean, I've known people, 100 and above. And so when you're talking about the multi-generational family, it used to be, a grandparent and a parent and a grandparent, a parent and a child, right? And there are great grandparents. Many people are great grandparents now. I don't know that I'll live to see that, but okay, whatever. But yeah, that is, it's 4 generations now. It's not 3 generations, right? And it's different thinking about, what the family structure is, which is, something that you've talked about with me, at length.
Well, let me go back to something that I think is really important. It's the development of professional medicine as a field and the hospital movement that took place after the Civil War. And every city started to build hospitals like crazy. So now aging adults, those were, when you had a 3-generation family, when the aging parents would often die in the house, now they were dying in hospitals. They were taken out of the home. So, modernization and changes in medicine, all these things impact the family structure. And it wasn't until post-World War II that we start reverting back again to aging parents dying in the home with their children. Now, suburbanization, post-World War II migration, soldiers coming back from Europe, resettling in different places of the country where they thought there was opportunity. Families, again, when I started studying families in the 1700s, it was rare for any family to move more than 20 miles away from where they were born.
Right.
Extremely rare. So, and 20 miles was almost a 2-day ride by horse.
Correct.
So,
it was very different, and everybody knows that it was very different. And with the advent of, people moving for jobs and airplane travel and all of that, obviously people are more dispersed, not only throughout this country and not only from, urban to suburban areas, but also around the world.
Well, one of the things that had a major impact on families was post-World War II when Harry Truman created the Veterans Act and the GI Bill, and you can get a house with, through the GI Bill, which you couldn't have afforded ever before, and you also can go to school for free on the GI Bill. And a lot of young Black men who came back from World War II took advantage of that, and they became the civil rights workers of the 1950s.
Right.
Because they were able to go for an education. They went to, of course, the HCBUs, historic Black colleges and universities, because schools were still segregated. They still couldn't go to white schools. But, their sudden professionalism and wealth changed the family structure of a lot of Black families and a lot of returning GIs who now, pilots came back from World War II. The airlines were growing. Now they would recruit from the military, from the Air Force, all the pilots, to fly commercial jets. So the nature of work was being transformative and was no longer localized. And that created changes in the family too. So, it became much more common that you would be in your 20s or 30s and you may not live anywhere near your parents any longer. And this was a whole new phenomenon. And it only started post-World War II.
Can I ask a question about that? Because I'm thinking not only about not living near your parents, because I don't think that came till much later, not right after World War II, but maybe later, like even in the 80s, 80s, and maybe even 90s. But when was it that people started going away to college? Because I think that also had an impact of, I remember when I was ready to go to college and my father, I lived in Brooklyn, and my father said that I could go to Brooklyn College like everybody else in the family. We had very successful people. A cousin was an assistant DA in Queens, and, very successful people in the family. And I said, no, I want to go away to college. I mean, my parents didn't know anything about that. They thought it was the craziest idea they ever heard. And actually, they said, my father said, well, if you want to go away, you pay. And I found the school. They drove me there. They had never seen it before. I went there for myself for the interview, and he co-signed the first loan application for me and then said, okay, if this is what you want to do, go ahead. So I think that with the advent of people going away to college, being away from their family may have also changed the mindset about living with the family once you came home from college. I mean, do you know anything about that?
I think you're missing a big step in here, and I go back to World War II, the end of World War II, and the GI Bill. The GI Bill allowed Arthur Levitt to build Levittown in Pennsylvania, then build it on Long Island, where he built something like 80,000 homes. There was a housing shortage in the cities, so right away, young people, returning veterans under the GI Bill, and then of course FHA mortgages came about also. But this has a lot to do with housing. They moved away from their families in the cities. My parents did that in 1951. They bought a Levitt house and moved us from Brooklyn, where all my family members were, and moved out 50 miles away. Now, 50 miles is a long distance.
It is.
And again, and it was suburbia. It was so these were all the people living in suburbia were uprooted from their families. And so I think even when you think about, there's two things here. I think you're right. The GI Bill also allowed, for example, a lot of black men that returned from World War II. On the GI Bill, they can go to an HCBU, and most of them are in the South.
Right.
So they migrate, and families in the South took them in and let them live with them. Black families took them in and were so proud of them. They were getting a college education, and they rerouted themselves and started living in the South. And that's why I said they became the first civil rights workers. So they started their families miles and miles away, and it had to do with the GI Bill more than anything else that allowed for this kind of migration and the idea of going away to school.
So that's from an African American point of view. And as you're talking about, I'm thinking about more, white middle class kids who went away to school, to a variety of schools, right?
That started in the 60s.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, well, I actually went away to school in 1969.
Yeah, that's when it started. And it had to do with a lot of things, opened admissions. So much had changed because the culture was shifting. So you had a lot more opportunity to go to a lot of different colleges that you wouldn't have access to before. But open admissions changed that and gave you more choice, and that created more distance. So, again, my interest was, when I look at the family, and again, this started in the 1980s, it was clear that there were three generations, and the senior generation now had sent, because they were the World War II generation. They wanted their children to have the education they may not have had.
Correct.
So they started sending their kids to college, and it took a lot of their money they would have used for retirement. It wasn't it was cheap relative to today, but it wasn't cheap back then.
Absolutely not.
So now you have a situation where a lot of their money is being spent, and then you have the housing problem. My kids are out of college now. They're getting married. They need help to start, to buy a house. And they often got jobs that were not local. Now, I went to high school. I still have some friends that never left from Long Island, where I was raised. They're still there. I mean, I find it unbelievable. But
I find that pretty unbelievable myself, but okay, whatever.
It's like a time warp.
Right. I absolutely.
But it used to be typical, and now it's the exception. By the 1960s, 70s, 80s, it becomes more of the exception than the norm. When I went into the Army, and when I came out, I lived in Long Beach. My parents live 30 miles away. My relatives live 50 miles away, and that was very typical. And so, we have this confluence of things, most of which came out of the GI Bill. It had a major impact on families, the family dynamics. And suburbanization was the other thing that had a major impact, So,
I just want to say, as you're saying, you were 30 miles away, someone was 50 miles away. And, I'm thinking now to some of the places that I used to travel with my parents when I was little. Places, when I say upstate New York, it's really not upstate New York anymore. Like, the Rockland County, which is over, but now it's the
Jersey
Marion
side.
Cuomo
The
Bridge,
Jersey
right?
side,
Right.
yeah.
But when I was a little girl, so traveling up there, because we lived in Brooklyn, it was almost like a trek, like you would think about going to
Yes, yes,
California. I
yes,
mean, I can remember us packing food and something to
yeah.
drink and whatever. It seemed like it was a 3-hour ride, and now you do it like it's the back of your hand. It's a nothing thing anymore. So even,
That's correct.
it's just changed so dramatically that even places that were far away before are no longer so far away.
Yeah, well, you see, now let's talk about this maybe from a little different angle now. So you have post-World War II, you have the boomer generation, and they're being more educated than any generation prior to the boomers by far. And that more went to college ever than before World War II. So they became professionals, they had better jobs, better incomes. And what really began to change, longevity. When you have,
Right,
and longevity starts to increase substantially, and today it's like 77 for males and like it's 81 for females.
right.
But now post COVID, we've had a reduction in the age of
Correct,
mortality. So,
correct.
there are always things which affect it, but when you had this longevity, now you had something that was unique by the time you're moving into the last quarter century of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. You now have 4-generation families where
Right,
grandparents take care of children, children take care of grandparents, parents take care of children and grandchildren. So roles become very, very, I mean, the roles change dramatically. Typically, in a 3-generation family, the grandparents were the matriarch and patriarch, and then you had children and grandchildren. Now you have
right,
children that are grown and working and have families of their own, and they have children, and the children now are going to college and getting married. So
right.
now the people in the middle, now they have to take care of aging parents who have used their resources on them considerably,
Correct.
and they probably also use some of their resources to fund or help fund the children's college, grandchildren,
Right. The
and
grandchildren. Right.
now you have great grandchildren. So the roles become unclear. I am a household to my children, but I'm a child to my parents
Right.
still.
Right.
And now you have now I'm a grandparent to my grandchildren. So I have now 3 roles. I'm
Right.
parent, grandparent, and I don't have the status of being the head of household, and the loss of this status for grandparents. It becomes very confusing, and the
Right.
dialogues, multi-generational dialogues, begin to change a lot.
Yeah.
And
I just want to add something at that point, something you said, which, as an adult child who's now, helping to care for an older parent, right?
mhm,
Um, and you said it in a way that reminded me I wanted to bring this up for people to think about, because many people think when they have an older parent, especially someone who has some needs or care needs or cognitive needs, that they're like parenting their parent, and that's actually not correct. And it's something that people should reorient their thinking about, because this is an adult person, and yes, you may need to help out, but to that person, you are still their child. It's interesting. Just a few weeks ago, so my daughter, who's 40, just turned 45, and she's a quite a strong personality, I'll say. Some people say, well, what did you expect? But okay, whatever. We won't get into that conversation. But she was telling me, she's a very strong personality. And listen, she's a grown woman and she has children of her own. And I was telling her something, or suggesting something, because I don't use the word should, but I was explaining something to her, and she kind of dismissed me in a way. And it was really the first time that I ever said this to her. And I said, I know you think you know everything, but you don't. I thought I knew everything at your age, and I didn't. So I'm just suggesting to you that, maybe think about this differently. Now, why is that? Because, and I'm a very independent person, but she still has this idea that probably down the road, or maybe sooner than later, she's going to have to take on different roles, like she did with my ex-husband, her father. And so, that's changing. She thinks that's changing that dynamic. But in reality, at that moment, I kind of had to explain to her that I'm still her mother. But people forget that. They really do forget that. And the dynamic becomes can become tense, and especially when the older parent starts to have care needs.
Well, this is why I said to you, it's more confusing than the sandwich generation. Who am I? I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent, I'm a child, all at the same time within my family. And this creates a tremendous role confusion. And the dialogue you're talking about happens because I'm an adult, but I'm your child.
Right.
Yeah. But then on the same token, they're a grandparent. So they don't feel that gap between generations, because they have 3 roles now, not just 2.
Right.
And so that generation, man, it's tough. It's really tough. And these are the things we don't think about. We don't think about how families need therapy, because the communication process has become extremely complex. There's money involved, there's education involved, there's decisions about college and military for children and grandchildren. I have financial needs, I have educational needs,
Right.
I have friends I have to think about. The multiple roles that people play every day, and the complexity of where they are at a given moment and how they have to shift gears is not easy. So,
that's a good point. That's a very good point. I haven't thought about that. But you're right. You have to shift gears, on a dime, actually. And in a moment's notice. And so that creates a lot of tension. It creates, like you're saying, like, who am I at this particular moment? What role am I taking on? It's almost like you're playing a role in a play, where you have different characters, but you're the person who has to take on all the different roles.
Yeah, and again, these roles are shifting all day long. They're not consistent. And then you have the other problem in terms of what mode of thinking am I using when I'm having a dialogue with my parent? If I say, I'm so glad you're healthy, is that wishful? Is that cognitive? But they are healthy, or is that moral? Because I want my parents to be around forever,
Right.
because they actually gave me my ethics, so
Right.
So what mode of thinking am I engaging in, wishful, moral, or cognitive, and what role am I in? I come home from work, and I may work in the financial sector, and I come home and I have to shift gears now because I have children or parents or grandchildren I need to talk with, and now cell phones and the internet have made it even more complex,
Absolutely.
not simpler. Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that, because I was going to say people think it's easier and simpler.
No.
It's actually not, quite the opposite of that. But, I just want to shift gears for a minute, if you don't mind, or for the remaining time that we have. Because, something that's very important to me, and not just to me, but to a lot of people, is the importance of intergenerational relationships. And we're kind of touching on it here in the family structure, but now I'm kind of taking it out of that family structure, because it is really important for people to understand that older people have a place not only in the family but in society. They have a wisdom, they have experience, something they could share, value, and that younger people should appreciate that. I use the word should, but that it would be great if they could really, as a society, appreciate that. I don't mean in their own family. They may love their grandparent or an older person or loved one, but I mean as a society. And because you're involved in music, and you have this show about jazz, and so much of the younger person, I think, especially in the music industry, respects and looks towards the older person who's been accomplished, who's played for so many years, who has experience. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
That's an interesting issue. And again, it's much more complex than meets the eye. Technology has a huge role in how people relate generationally, a huge role.
Right.
And then up through the 1990s, you had record labels and radio that dominated music. And of course, there were many artists who were ripped off, who never got their just desserts because the record label controlled all the money. They can say how many records they sold, and you have no way of verifying it.
Right.
So there were problems, but they also had something called A&R. They would groom you. They put you out as an opening act for other more established, more named artists, and they would give you studio time. They would tell you how to dress. They would help cultivate your sound and your music. So, as restrictive as it may have been, they were the arbiters of taste. It wasn't the public. It was a record label and A&R that determined who's going to be played on the radio.
Wow.
And
okay.
So now with the changing technology, you have streaming. Now there is really nothing to mediate and to say this is good quality, because now it's based on how many spins you have on the radio and how many streams do you have downloaded. And so the technology has changed, and the kind of music that's put out doesn't have the kind of censors that it used to have. Now you can make the argument that was really oligarchic and hierarchical, and these were just old men cultivating taste. But the difference was that they had some idea of the past and what music should sound like. That's gone today. It's gone, and that's why a lot of music. And again, this I'm in the music industry, and this is my own bias. A lot of music is not even music anymore. A lot of rap music is syncopation. It's not music, and so so much that's out there now has drifted away from who came first. Of talking about the transmission of knowledge within the music industry. So you have a few artists that do go back. There's very few. There's a guy, Bruno Mars, and he sampled all of the R&B from the 1960s and 70s in his music. And he has deep respect for those artists. Every day, Phyllis, one of the things when you get to be my age, a lot of the artists that I was raised with that were incredibly gifted are dead. And it's hard, unless an artist does covers and tries to keep that music alive, it's harder and harder to make those connections between music that came before, between the Bessie Smiths of the 1920s and the Ella Fitzgeralds. It's harder and harder to make those connections.
Yeah, but
it has to do with technology.
Yeah, but I was with a friend last week, and he really knows music and the history of music and loves music, and we got into conversations about many different things, and he played a I don't remember if it was an album, but he had it on his phone, and he said, do you know who it was? And I didn't recognize who the voices were, but he asked me if I ever saw the documentary about Roy Orbison, and I had seen it, and Bruce Springsteen played backup to Roy Orbison. Yeah. And so, when you talk about the history or even jazz, which is rooted in Black music from the South, and spirituals and country music is rooted in that. And there's, what I have found in, the music industry is people are tremendously respectful of the people that went before.
Stop for a minute. How old was your friend? How old is your friend you spoke to?
72.
I rest my case. That's my point. They have an appreciation for the past. That is exactly my point. But streaming has destroyed this completely. First of
Hmm.
all, it's digitized. It's not analog. So a lot of the actual quality of sound is tremendously diminished. So when you get the stream, it doesn't sound like the original recording at all. And you wouldn't
Mhm.
know this because you never heard the original recording. And again, when you talk about, one of the shows on Source Radio is a show called Sounds of the Diaspora. It's by a super gifted drummer, jazz musician, Dion Parson, who was in the Virgin Islands, and he was trained in New York, and he played with all the great jazz greats, with the Miles Davises, and I mean, I can go on and on, but the people he has on his show typically are in their 60s, because these people still play straight ahead jazz, and they play bebop, and it, but he doesn't have a lot of 20-year-olds on because they're not playing that music.
Well, let me just say, so I go to this VFW in Westport, Connecticut, where they have jazz on Thursday nights, and what I do find, and they do have a nonprofit associated with it to help develop young people who are interested in jazz and artists, and they have them come in sometimes and play with some of the older artists, whether they're drummers or bass players or singers or whoever it is, saxophonists, piano players. And so I have found there, and that may be peculiar just to what they're trying to do, right? Their mission, which is to continue jazz and develop jazz knowledge and jazz artists with their nonprofit and the scholarships they offer. So maybe I'm seeing this microcosm that's not really reflective of the entire industry, because I see it very much there, the respect and the grooming from one generation of artists to the other.
Let's talk about that. Tell me how many jazz stations there are in Connecticut right now.
I have no idea. Zero.
I think there's one. And
Oh, okay.
and here's the problem. Urban music has crowded it all out because, again, streaming leads to fans. Fans lead to spins on radio stations. There's no arbiter any longer of quality or links to the past. So, yes, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there aren't foundations and there aren't adults in the jazz community who aren't mentoring young people. They certainly are. But that used to be the popular music, and generations would always reflect back on the Benny Goodmans and Lionel Hamptons, and
Right.
you ask any kid today who was Lionel Hampton, yes, they won't have a clue. And that I knew, and Lionel Hampton was already at the end of his career when I was a teenager, but I always knew about the artists that came before.
Right.
But it doesn't work that way anymore. I mean, even if you talk about the 1960s and 70s, you talk about outside of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and a few big bands, a lot of the bands that were around that were exceptional, like Chicago, who had a tremendous horn and jazz section.
Yes.
They intersected rock and progressive jazz. You ask kids today, they haven't a clue who they are.
Right.
And
right.
so this is my point. I'm not saying that there isn't mentoring. I'm not saying there aren't serious young kids who really do love jazz and want to know its history. They're there, but it's not mainstream. And you don't see the mentoring has diminished significantly. You don't see it as much as you used to.
So then that's no different than in society, our society as a whole. Which is why I brought this up. I thought it would be different, but apparently it isn't. And maybe it's more not the norm, but the unusual somebody, which came up in one of the first few shows I did, about Tony Bennett and Lady Gaga. I mean, there are always people who are older who team up with younger people, and they transcend the generations. But it's probably, like you're saying, more not the norm.
No, it isn't.
unfortunately, then it is the norm. And so then that really is reflective of what's happening in society as a whole about respecting older people, understanding history, understanding the wisdom that older people bring to the conversation, to the family, wherever.
Phyllis, you're 100% right. And here's the issue to me, and this is why I always love history and study history. In the 1960s till 2000, a major effort was made to recover our history, which had, to use the term, whitewashed, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And the role of women. They developed what was called herstory, Herstory. Yeah,
Right.
because they were trying to recover how many great women there were that were just left out because they weren't
Right.
white men. So we went through this period of trying to recover our history. Now we're in a period of remaking our history. Suddenly, the people that invaded the Capitol are patriots, and they're political prisoners, and so we're going through a period where history is not being recovered; it's being lost once again, and and it has to do with technology. It has to do with political capital. There's a variety of things, and how would you describe in 2024 the American family when you compare it to 1964? I mean, it's like you're talking about people from Mars.
Yeah, I agree with you
Yeah,
150%.
and
And
we've
sorry,
lost
go
in
ahead.
our
I'm
society.
sorry.
Yeah, I'm just going to say we've lost in our culture recovering the wisdom of older generations, of making it fundamental to who we are as a society. It's we're in the period that's reactionary, that wants to deny anything that really has value, and with that goes age, and I think
I
yeah.
I agree. And actually, I think, and maybe this is just about, me personally and, where I am in my family dynamic. But I think the perception of what an older person is or quote unquote should be has to radically change. So I know in my family, because I'm not what maybe the thought process was of what an older person would be like. I don't fit that mold. No, I know there's difficulty around that. And that goes along with understanding that as people are living longer, maybe living more healthfully, more vibrantly, have more purpose or a sense of, a passion or a desire, that we have to, as a society, look at older people differently, feel about them differently. And that, then have that hopefully will impact our understanding of their value in society. Did I make that clear?
It's clear, but I don't want to politicize your show, but our Vice President JD Vance, he has been an advocate for having more children because we've actually had a decline now in the number of children per
Correct.
household. And if you have more children, you're raising more workers. If you're raising more workers, you're building the consumer society, and you don't need immigrants. We can raise our own people here. And
Right.
but there's a political agenda that is behind the whole idea that we're not having enough kids. We're not having enough kids because of two things. Women now are more independent, and
Correct.
that's because they have careers and education. And second of all, who the hell can afford a $450,000 house when you're 25 years old? So establishing your household is become a dream. So we're going to see a decline in birth rate, and that's going to make a huge difference in how we view families in this country.
Well,
But,
well,
it's being politicized.
the
Yeah,
reality is a third of the population, as I say in the beginning, is over the age of 50. And, by the year 2030, the over 65 population will outnumber the people who are under the age of 18, which I'm sure they're well aware of. And it's not just that the United States, the demographic is getting older, it's getting older around the world. It's not just an American issue.
so
It's an
let's talk about that.
issue.
What does it mean for Social Security?
Right, exactly.
So you have to raise the cap on people that are wealthy, and they have to pay more. I mean, they can afford it, That's not the issue. It's a political issue.
Correct.
And so, so you're raising all the points that are going to affect families down the road now. We're in a major transition period of what families are going to be like. More than likely, women will have children later. So you're not only going to have fewer children, but you're going to have older parents, of those children. And that becomes a generational issue.
Right.
So, yeah, we're in a transitionary period right now. And I'm not very optimistic about how it's looking over the next 25 years.
Really?
Yeah, I'm not at all.
Oh.
I don't think we respect aging.
That's true.
I don't think we intend, look, they're trying to cut down on Medicare, they're trying to cut down on Medicaid, they want to cut down on Social Security. And they talk about criminals. There's no criminals. They just want to transfer the money to tax breaks for people that have more money.
Right.
So these are political decisions that are going to have great consequences over the next 2 generations. So I
have an issue with not to get into too much of a political conversation. We only have another minute or 2 left. But the other issue is that yes, they want to increase the number of people having children, but if a number of the people having children can't really afford those children, and then you want to cut Medicaid, I want to know who's going to take care of those children for the people who have more children and can't afford to have children.
George Carlin, the comedian who I adored, who's no longer with us, George Carlin once said that this country will do anything to protect the unborn, but once you're born, you're on your own.
I think you said that to me once, and it's really true. But listen, Mel, this has been so fantastic. I mean, I'm so thrilled that that you were able to be flexible, step in at the last minute to join me on the program. And we've had many, many conversations, but I'm glad that we finally were able to, even though it was a last minute thing, have the conversation on the show. And I hope people, viewers and listeners, appreciated your insights regarding aging, how the generational family has evolved, and, your insights about relationships, even in the music industry, whether they're favorable or unfavorable, were really invaluable. So I can't thank you enough.
Well, I appreciate it. And in the music industry, it's become much more democratized. And in the music industry, that's not a good thing.
Okay.
that means democracy stands in for taste.
Okay, we'll leave it. We'll leave it right there.
Okay. You have a wonderful evening, and thank you for having me on.
Thanks so much, Mel. Please join me next Wednesday, May 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for Senior Nation to hear my conversation with my next guest, Carly Roman Wu, who is a gerontologist currently serving as program officer at Archdown Foundation, a private grant-making nonprofit whose mission is to improve the health and well-being of older Californians and their caregivers. In her role, Dr. Roman Wu leads and oversees the technology strategy within the foundation's focus on care coordination, with an interwoven commitment to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So remember to tune in, comment, and ask questions on May 7th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the SORC TVRadio network. And until then, take care, stay well, and stay tuned.
Go for it. I'm just saying I'm not finished yet. Search for it, swing for it. Discover the me that lives in yes. Stand for it, stretch for it. It's my time, imagine my best. Run for it, reach for it. Uncover the me that lives in yes. I know, yes I know. There'll be miracles wherever I go. It's not work, it's play. I can make magic today.